Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, Kia. Hearty welcome to all of you, and I'm really glad that I'm able to kind of present this and see how much value I can add to you. So what I'm here for, and I'm really trying to see, and I'm trying to kind of get back into my shoes a decade back when I came out freshly out of college, and I joined JP Morgan's investment banking team to start with. And there was a training to start with in JP Morgan. However, I saw that even the training in the corporate didn't really stack up to what I was actually doing. And in fact, what I realized is a lot of the training that happens, whether in college or even in corporate as a training and not on the job, is very wide and broad because you never know where you land up and which particular specific business division or work stream you kind of work on. But then, as you work on that particular work stream and you become an expert in that, you have to keep on doing the same thing over and over again, and as you grow through the ranks you kind of expand your skills, but it happens more like a funnel where you start off in a very narrow and you become an expert in that and you keep on growing your expertise. Now, I'll share my screen. I made a kind of short presentation. Yeah. So, what I've called this presentation is connecting the dots, because there's a lot of information that we get to know and that we are taught in college, as well as in corporate during our training sessions, and we really kind of get bombarded, and sometimes we don't have the perspective of how it's utilized in the corporate world, and whether all of it gets utilized in the same breath, because like we take a very impartial view to the whole kind of subject and we read everything impartially, but there are certain pockets of that particular training that is more kind of put to use or practically used in specific divisions. So without much ado, I just have this little disclaimer because I'm working in a related sector. I would like to mention that these are all my personal views and none of it reflect my past or present organization's views in any way, and none of this should be taken as a financial trading or investment advice. It's more for training purposes. Now, investor profiling. So I have kept this in the more like an interactive way, but I know that the interaction is a challenge. So we can take all the questions at the end because I need to shuffle between my screen sharing and my other screen. So I just want to say that investments has two legs to it. So I would try to speak about things that I know about. So investments is what I have been into for the past 13 years, post my MBA. And I would like to first kind of touch upon what is it that, before getting into valuation, I think valuation comes a lot later, but before that we have to see the holistic picture as to why is it that we would like to make a particular investment. And even before that we need to know what is the investor profile. Like for example, if we are a fund, the investor profile is very well kind of documented in the sense that which are the sectors that you want to invest in, what are the ticket sizes you want to invest in, what are the kind of sectors that you would like to look at, what is the kind of negative list of sectors that you wouldn't invest in, what are the kind of promoters you like to back, would you like to have promoters who have put in a lot of money in their businesses and therefore have a lot of skin in the game. So this is what this slide talks about. So before we get into the investment mode, we need to understand, and we are backed by our investors, right? So we need to know what is the mandate that we've been given under our what we call the PPM, private placement memorandum. So there's a very clear cut mandate that's given to us by our investors, and it clearly matches the kind of investments that they want to do. The first thing is the corpus. How big is the corpus, and how many investments would you like to make out of it? So corpus, expected holding period, very critical. So even when we look at, like, I am speaking more from an institutional investing part of it, but this can be very similarly applied to a personal investment, which is what also something that I've been doing in my own kind of independent way. But yeah, a lot of this applies equally, if not more, to your personal investment. So first, you need to know how big your corpus is. Secondly, what is your expected holding period? So if you are looking for a short-term investments versus to a medium to a long-term, it should be very clearly set out. Without that, there is no investment. You need to very clearly know what is it, till what time can you hold that particular investment, and you need not have a liquidity crunch to cash in out of that investment. Thirdly, risk appetite, again, across the board for institutions or retail. What is your risk appetite? Are you in the high risk zone, moderate, low risk zone? And accordingly, you'll have to pick sectors which have that risk reward profile. So higher the risk, higher the reward. Mostly, your expected returns are higher. If your expected cost of equity is higher, your discounting rate is higher. So that's the typical thing, although there could be aberrations. particularly when there are market shocks, there could be certain sectors which could have a risk reward profile which is very kind of in a way obtuse or in a way inverted. Liquidity, once our investors are committed, they have to be in it. It's a closed-ended fund. You can't cash out. You have to be very clear how you manage your liquidity. You have to, if there are certain urgent requirements of cash, you need to be very clear that you can't dip into the pools of money that you've invested for the long term. Portfolio mix, whether you want a totally diversified portfolio, as like when you look at, like, I also invest in a lot of startups. Now that is purely a diversification game, because the risk reward ratio is extremely kind of inclined towards high risk and high reward, but mostly high risk. So out of 20 investments, maybe 4 of them survive, and out of them 2 might be successful. I think that could be a kind of a indicative kind of success to failure ratio in a startup space. You would like to have smaller tickets in a larger pool of investments, so that at least the few investments that kind of baggers that can recover your investment in all the others, as well as make you a lot of money at a portfolio level. Just trying to do a check on the time. Okay, so market timing, no one knows about this, but you always need to know, even if you have to raise funds, like for example, if you are running an institution, you need to raise funds, you need to hit the market at a time when there are pools of capital available. So that's critical. Again, if there are any negative list sectors, there are certain sectors like tobacco, like certain sectors which are alcohol, maybe, which is not as part of your mandate that's given by your investors. Or if there are any asset classes, like as I said, the private equity fund I have been working with and I'm still working with today is more of an infra and a related resources or real assets focused fund. So we have to always see that we are somewhere within the boundaries that are chalked out for us. So just to start with, who are you? Like, this is more from a perspective of again, be an institution or an individual. Who are you? Are you an investor, long-term player, or are you a trader, or you're a hedge fund, right? You are more like looking for a short-term gain. So that is very critical that you need to establish right up front. So if I make a very broad-based kind of distinction between what an investor and a trader would look like, an investor would largely be on a long-only strategy. I guess what long and short mean, you would be aware, or like, if I can just explain very quickly. So long is where you buy and you hold for a long period of time. That's long only. Long and short is when you buy and sell, buy and sell. Sometimes you sell early and buy later, which is called a shorting the market. Or you buy first and sell later, or you sell first and buy later, and you keep on doing it in quick succession. And that's what a trader does. So for an investor, critical thing is you are generally a long only. You buy and hold. Your exit criteria is you have very clearly defined exit returns, expected returns from your investment, unless there are certain events that kind of shift the entire paradigm for the business or the company. But you'll exit keeping in mind your holding period, but you'll exit at a price which is higher than your expected returns. Your time frame could run into years typically, but it could also be months at times when there are certain shocks, or there could be certain incidents which are not visible. Evaluation method, you typically use what is called a fundamental analysis. I don't know whether all of you would have done courses on fundamental analysis, but that's typically what is used, and I'll come into detail because that's what my bread and butter is. I have always used fundamental analysis for what I do in my job, although I do a lot of technical analysis also for my personal investments. But when it comes to the job, I can only rely on fundamental analysis. And the good part about fundamental analysis is it's basically a kind of top down, it's kind of a bottom up approach in a way, because you look into the financial statements of the company, the balance sheet, the cash flow statement, the P&L, and you look at the various metrics. You use a discounting rate, you find the value of the company, and you compare that against what the market looks like, right? Market benchmarks. A trader, on the other hand, would use typically, as I said, a long short strategy. So they would buy and sell in quick succession to make quick gains. Exit criteria, it's either you hit the price target or you hit a stop loss. So you're always within that price target and stop loss, and your risk reward is always whatever you are entering at versus the price target. That's your reward, and wherever you're entering at minus the stop loss, that's the risk. So you find the risk reward and you'll pay on a risk reward which is good, or which stacks in your favor. Your time frame could be hours, minutes, days, weeks. It could be anything. Weeks is fairly unlikely, but yeah, hours, days. So there are a lot of day traders that I know of, and they really get their kind of kick out of this. I would say more kick than money, because this is largely kick. If you look at it, people who've made money over fairly long periods of time, like the big legendary investors like Warren Buffett. They've made it over long periods of time through the power of compounding and through long only strategies. They've done some quick. So typically the way people work is when they have shorter, smaller corpuses, they could take a little bit. Again, I'm talking about personal investments here, but small amounts, little amounts you can do for trading, and you can slowly build the corpus, but you run the risk there to lose your shirt also. You have to be very careful, but then it's a strategy. If you've learned well, you could add in a little bit of a corpus there, and then you put for the long term in strong, fundamentally strong companies. And because and the method that you use for evaluation in case of a trader is a technical analysis. You read the charts and you analyze the charts, and it can be only done for listed because you need to see the history of the stock and its other proxies, other comparable companies. What we are going to focus on today is largely the investor side of it, which is the institutional investing, which is where I've been working for all these years. So there's something called a market price, and there's a value. I think your professors would have taught you about this. Uh, Price is very different from value. Price is what you pay, value is what you get, is what Warren Buffett says. So price is actually just a negotiated number between two parties, and it may or may not have any uh, linkage to what the value is. It may not have. Sometimes you are like euphoria in the market, and a lot of stocks get overvalued. Sometimes there's just like it is now. There's a lot of kind of negative sentiment in the market, and everything gets dumped. It's not so yet, but it could get there. So when do you buy? Like this is again put in a very simplistic terms. There could be aberrations, be specific scenarios where you need to adjust your strategy. But you buy typically when your price that you're getting is lesser than the value. So you pay a price lesser than what your intrinsic value is, and you typically buy undervalued stocks. And I'm talking more from an investor standpoint, not from a technical or from a trading standpoint, where you'll work between your resistance and supports. So and when you sell when your price that you're getting is more than the value, the expected value, your expected value, and the value is more than your expected return. So if you thought that this investment could make me 10% returns, and you're making 12% returns today, that's the value that you're getting. And what the price that you're getting is maybe slightly higher, right? So the price, if it's higher than your expected returns, that's where you sell. And it is typically for stocks which are you'll buy it when it is valued higher than what, like the price is higher than what the value is, so you are overvalued in a way. But how do we determine this particular elusive term called value? And before I get into the valuation part of it, I would like to make it clear, and I know that you would also kind of realize it. There is no rocket science in valuation. In fact, it's part science, part art, as I would say. There's no foolproof method. There will always be kind of a difference or variance between how I value something versus how a third party values something, X values something, Y values something. In fact, I have been kind of doing these valuations for decade, and I've been we required to do a lot of third party valuations, like third party appraisals for our portfolios, and we get to speak to all the big four firms, the big four auditors, KPMG, NY, and the likes. And each and every time we have certain kind of differences in terms of how they value versus how we value, and we converge somewhere. But what I would like to say that things, even like over a period of time, the methodology that a big four uses, they will change over a period of time. Like for example, something as simple as a risk-free rate. Uh, we would typically use a point estimate, like what is it at the end of the quarter for valuing, for getting the quarter's valuation. But then there could be situations where people might use an average rate because the risk-free rate is very volatile. So there are things which happen and which are taken by convention or by practice, by market practice. Although we would always like to follow the book and exactly follow what your professors say, what the books say, or what Ashwath Damodaran says, more often than not, we might have to adjust our strategies depending on how the market, because we have to keep in mind that our value is not value as of today. Although it's technically value as of the valuation date, but we are not selling today. We are in it for a long period of time because we are an investor. So we need to take that. So there could be certain kind of averaging that you need to do at certain points in time to put in perspective that we are long-term investors. We are not looking to cash out today at whatever value is available today. So putting with that in perspective, let's dive into what is the determinant of value. And this is so critical. I think valuation is just a spreadsheet. You can in Excel, you have certain inputs that in kind of build up to your revenues, to your costs, to your cash flows, to your to your debt, to your equity, to your everything, working capital, and all of that. All of that is pure kind of math, and anybody can do it. Like you just give it to a computer, maybe in like there could be certain algorithms can work out that entire valuation. That's not critical. What is critical in this, I'm speaking from experiences, where it really hurts is not valuation, although because the price that you pay is mostly determined by the market, right? There's a willing seller at a certain price, and you're buying at that price. So price, obviously you'd like to buy it cheapest, buy low, sell high. You would like to buy it when the price is the lowest. You would definitely try to do that. But before that, even before you bring a particular investment in front of the investment committee and you say that I want to make this investment, valuation will typically be the last discussion. Before that, we would like to understand all these various aspects which are so critical for an investment to be successful over long periods of time. So the first thing is obviously something, and these are all things that you've studied in management, in finance, but I would say that these are so critical to build value and to preserve value over a long period of time. It's not what you're paying today. It's all about how much value it generates. The first thing is obviously the competitive advantage, or what many people call moat. Moat is technically around those forts. They used to have this ditch of water which would prevent any invasion into the fort. So what is it that prevents anyone taking away your competitive advantage and you being wherever you are in terms of your leadership position or in terms of your market share, you kind of holding on to your market share despite all the challenges? That is critical. Like for example, there is a lot happening in India in terms of movement from like it had happened because there was GST and there was so many things that were happening, even kind of movement to digital payments and everything else. So a lot of these fragmented industries had seen some sort of consolidation, or there was an expectation that there is some sort of consolidation. But what is it that which are the companies which are still like kind of rock proof, like they are proof of this kind of movement in the market? So that's your competitive advantage that holds you good in any environment. Second, and I would say this is probably the most important preserver and creator of value, but the most difficult for anyone to gauge. Like my bosses have been in the industry for 30 years, and they've got a lot of kind of insight of how to get a sense of how good a sponsor is he of good integrity, is the team good enough, is the team proactive enough, are the team like are they people, is the sponsor something who has skin in the game? That's easy to understand. But is he someone willing to put in his effort and not just sit on his laurels once he's created a business? Is he a person who will not go back on his promises to his shareholders and other stakeholders? Is he someone who will always be proactive in terms of building value, be receptive to what the shareholders are saying? He will always follow the rules of corporate governance. That is so important. And you see, whatever is beaten down today in the public markets, you'll see more often than not, they first have something to do with the corporate governance. So this is probably the biggest creator of value. You back the right promoters. Then you have certain aspects, government regulations, very true for highly regulated sectors such as infrastructure, real estate. I'll just have a very critical. I have been in sectors such as power and road, and there have been so many shifts in policies, and we've seen the highs and the lows of those industries. And it has been entirely driven out of government regulation. So very critical to have a sense as to what the broad contours of the government policy is, so that you can ride on it in the right when you don't get it wrong. Then you have the industry size and dynamics, very important. Again, you might have a market share, but you need growth as well. Is the industry big enough for you to accommodate you to go from point A to point B? So you want that particular industry to grow and also your market share to grow within that big pie. So very critical. Risks and mitigants. Probably this is the place, this is the area where we spend the most time on our investment decisions, where we try to identify what are the various risks in the business, and we need to figure out what are the potential mitigants. So if you say that we take any industry, maybe we take say maybe a financial services industry. You take a bank. So risk of NPAs, risk of non-performing assets. So what are the mitigants? Number one, you have good clients, AAA rated clients. Secondly, or X% of your clients are AAA rated. Secondly, you have very strong processes so that any kind of red flag is easily escalated, and you have redressal mechanisms for that. Third, You might have provisions, and you have a very strong provisioning thing. You have very strong committees where every particular proposal is approved, has like several pair of eyes looking at it. It gets approved. There's a very strong process in place. So for every risk, and every business will have a risk. If you are not playing risk, you are not going to have any returns. Then you are very good investing in government securities and staying at home. There's no point of you saying that I don't want risk. We all want risk. The risk is what gets us reward, but we need to be very clear as to what are the mitigants are in case the risk were to play out against us. And the fourth and the last one, last determinant, which is very, very, very critical, is the access to funding. A lot of companies get into a soup, and we hear all of these companies which go bankrupt and getting into NCLT and so on and so forth. Most of these companies had a plan, and they were too ambitious. Not all of them. Some of them were too ambitious. They put in money in a lot of buckets, but they didn't secure their financing over periods of time. Markets are volatile. Markets could potentially be volatile. So it's a cycle. So you have to always have those kind of contingency plans where you know that there is certain war chest available, certain cash available for you, certain funding channels available to you in the event that the liquidity dries up in the market. So all of these are so important for any investment decision, which comes much before value. And after all of this, we come to what is called valuation, and whether we are getting the value that we are looking at in the company. So I'm diving straight into fundamental valuation, which is what we use for long-term investment. So fundamental analysis, very fundamental valuation. It's split into two buckets, broad buckets. One is absolute valuation, which is a bottom up, and the other one is relative valuation, where you compare your company versus other benchmarks or proxies in the market. So intrinsic valuation could be a discounted cash flows or a dividend discount, and we'll come into more detail on those. And there's a relative valuation, which is either a trading comparables, like how the company has been trading in terms of various multiples versus its benchmarks, or if there's certain transactions that have happened in the market, in the sector, or for the company itself, or if there are any listed proxies, like if you have certain companies which are maybe a parent company or a grandparent company, and you can do some kind of sum of the parts to understand what the valuation could be if there were a transaction in any of the any of the related entities. So these are the broad kind of ways of how you do fundamental valuation. I'll quickly dive into discounted cash flow. Now, again, I want to keep it very broad because I just want to get a sense as how you are placed in terms of connecting the dots. Some of this you may have already learned. Some of it might be coming up in your subsequent sessions in your college. But broadly, I'll give you a quick sense. If you don't understand something, I could kind of take questions at the end. But broadly, in terms of DCF or discounted cash flows, this is a fundamental way, an absolute valuation methodology where we do a bottom up. So we look at the financials, we look at what the cash flows would look like on a projected basis. So you have 10 years cash flows, 15, 20, 30 years cash flows. It's easier for something like infrastructure where you have long-term concessions, like a road will have a 30-year or 20-year concession with the National Highways Authority. So it's easier to kind of lay out the cash flows. But in certain sectors, it may not be very practical or easy to do. But broadly, when you're looking at discounted cash flow analysis, you would look at either an FCFE or an FCFF, or a free cash flow to firm or a free cash flow to equity. Now, the cash flows that you'd use, and these are things that kind of any textbook can teach you, and that's why I'm saying that these are things which are much easier to know. And once you start working on these, you could kind of build spreadsheet after spreadsheet, and it's very easy to do. It's very mechanical. But what is critical is the insights and getting those nuggets as to why you do certain things in certain circumstances and why you do certain other things when the scenarios are different. So free cash flow to firm is nothing but your cash flow to operations plus cash flow to investing with adjustments. So in your cash flow to operation, you need to take out the interest net interest cost, and because that adjustment that you do, because that's part of the cash flow to financing. But barring that, very simplistically put, it is CFO plus CFI. Free cash flow to equity is your CFO plus CFI plus the change in debt and the interest expense. So you just take out. So very quickly, and like just to understand very easily, you have a firm. A firm is built out of, so on the asset side, you have all the assets of the firm. On the liability side, liability and equity side, you have equity, you could have preferred equity, and you have debt. So the value of the firm, which is the left hand side, the asset side, and the value of when you talk about equity, you need to see what the pecking order is. So in terms of pecking order, I think you would know what a pecking order is. Pecking order is what ranks higher in terms of payout. So for example, a lender will have a priority over a preferred guy, a preferred investor. A preferred investor will have priority over common equity. So a lender, whenever there is an amount of cash that needs to be paid out, the first sweep that will happen will be to the debt. Next one will happen to the preferred equity or the mezzanine debt, and the third or whatever payout, if at all, will go as dividends or maybe capital appreciation, but mostly dividends. It will go to the equity shareholders. But if it will always be in that order, and that's what we call a pecking order. So when we look at firm, it's just your cash flow to operations and investing, because those are firm decisions. When you're looking at equity, you have those things, you have already come to the firm level, and you take out the debt, because debt comes before equity. So whatever is the residual cash flows after servicing debt, and it could also include preferred, by the way, and I have not assumed that there's any preferred in this particular company, but if there's any preferred, you have to also take out flows to preferred, and what is left behind as a residual cash flows is what is available to equity holders, and that's what you call FCFE. Now, what do you discount these cash flows with? If it's an FCFF, you discount it using what is called a weighted average cost of capital, and the simplistic formula is laid out here, which is the cost of debt into 1 minus the marginal tax rate plus the cost of equity multiplied by equity by the total capital. Similarly, for the cost of equity, you use typically what is called, this is on the FCFE side, you'll discount the FCFE using the cost of equity, and for that we typically use the capital asset pricing model, which is RF plus beta into RM minus RF. The market risk minus the risk-free rate gives you the equity risk premium. That multiplied by the beta, I would assume that you know what beta is. Beta is largely kind of an indicator of variance, a variability. So it's basically, so market is 1 beta. So Sensex would be beta equal to 1. If you have certain stocks which are lesser volatile or lower volatility than Sensex, you will call they have a beta of lesser than 1. If you have certain stocks which are more volatile than the market, then the Sensex, you will have beta of greater than 1. So that's an indicator of beta. So what it says is you have the risk-free rate, which is what you get on government 10-year government bonds. Then you have the market risk. So whatever Sensex has given over the past maybe 20 years, average kind of return, that minus the risk-free rate. So that's the additional risk that you get from investing in the market. That multiplied by the additional beta or the additional variability or the additional risk that you're taking. This is systematic risk. Again, I won't get into too much detail, but what is the additional risk? And because of that risk only, that you will get the higher kind of risk premium that you're getting, the equity risk premium. There could be certain additions to this, like for example, when you're investing in private companies as a private equity fund, you will add certain more factors to this, like for example, something like an illiquidity premium. So public markets are typically liquid. There are several stocks which are not liquid, and therefore you should have a higher kind of, there should be an additional risk premium there, which you can call an illiquidity risk premium. There is no hard and fast way of kind of getting those numbers, but it should always be higher than what a stock listed and fairly liquid on the exchange should look like. So private equity companies or private investments should have a discount rate or a cost of equity which is higher than a same company listed in the, like a company in the same sector but listed on the exchange. It will have a lower cost of equity compared to a private company. So what you get after discounting the FCFF using the weighted average cost of capital is what is called the enterprise or the firm value, which is what I had said. A firm value is nothing but then preferred equity or mezzanine capital or mezzanine debt, whatever you call, and equity. So all put together, that's your enterprise value. And when you discount FCFE using cost of equity, you get equity value. And you can actually get the enterprise value and equity value. You can get, when you have one of those, you can get the other one. So even when you are using FCFF, you get the enterprise value. So all you need to do is, using this formula, you need to adjust the enterprise value. You need to reduce the value of the debt, the value of the preferred capital, and you add back the cash. So cash is typically added back because, so when you're looking at enterprise value, so as I said, enterprise value is equity plus debt plus preferred. In the order, it should be debt, preferred, and equity in that pecking order. But you reduce the cash there, and that is because cash is typically non-productive. Like if you just leave cash in a company, it's non-productive. So that's why you typically don't value, you take that out when you calculate your enterprise value. So you just use this formula when you're using FCFF method, you can still get your equity value. You just need to adjust your enterprise value using this formula and you get your equity value. So that's largely a bottom up approach. You could use spreadsheets. So spreadsheets will, like, this is all that is there to DCF, or how you do fundamental valuation. This is all we do for private investments. And because I have worked in sectors like real assets or infrastructure and related resources, power, roads, waste to energy, and so on and so forth, renewable, all of those we only use DCF. However, there are a lot of sectors which I look at on a personal investment space. Those are largely in areas where you can't have cash flows predicted into the future for long periods of time, and that's where we need to resort to something called a relative valuation, or what we simply call the market multiple. So there are several market multiples, and I'm sure you would be familiar with a lot of those. So there are several factors, and the most kind of commonly used market multiple is a price to earnings, which is nothing but your market price divided by the earnings per share, and that's very closely tracked. That's probably something that you would see being quoted on CNBC for each and every stock, and very closely monitored by the market. Then we have something called an enterprise value to EBITDA. This is something that we use more for infrastructure companies which are heavy on capital, like which are capital intensive, because you would like to know what the firm value is. Again, as I said, it's the other kind of aspect to this is that many of these infrastructure companies may not be PAT positive, because they are very capital intensive. They are hugely leveraged, so they might have accumulated losses in the first few years of operations, and then they start turning kind of positive on PAT. So typically for infra companies, and this could vary between sectors, typically for infra we use EV by EBITDA more than price to earnings. Price to book, you could use it for any stock, particularly for finance companies. This is the one that they use a lot. It's basically the market price divided by the book value per share. And this is very critical, because it's basically how much premium you are paying to the dollar that's already invested in the company. So the dollar that's there on the book, how much a premium or discount. It could be even less than one. So you are paying a discount, you're getting at a discount. So that's a very critical, multiple that we typically look at. Dividend yields, particularly for stocks which yield a lot of dividends, the Hero Motocorp, and all those stocks. Uh, it's your dividend per share divided by market price per share. So a lot of people who are interested more on dividends, a lot of people who are interested more on capital appreciation. But yeah, at least where I'm coming from, infrastructure companies, as I said, a lot of leverage on their books. So they typically don't give dividends. It's like in the initial years, and once you have certain kind of reached a certain maturity in terms of your life cycle, you have an exit for the investor. And again, you might decide to pay out dividends, but it's typically a one-off exit that you give to the investor. PEG ratio, for typically used for high growth companies. P for a company which is in a initial stage of growth, maybe 2 into its since inception, whereas a company which is into your 5th year of operations in the same sector, it may not be kind of practical to compare the P ratios for both of them, because one of them has a growth which is the smaller company, or a early stage company will have a much higher growth rate compared to a late stage company. So you need to adjust for the life cycle, and that's what the PG ratio does. It adjusts it for the growth rate in those earnings. EV to sales, again used for sectors like retail and all. These have all their own kind of drawbacks, where to use, where not to use, but typically there are conventions. There are certain sectors which use one ahead of the other, and more like it's like an industry convention, and everyone needs to follow it, just to be as part of the pack. There could be sector specific multiples as well, like you have EV to megawatt for power, EV to subscriber, EV to customer, EV to footfall for retail, EV to eyeball for any online company. So a lot of these sector specific multiples that also come into play depending on which sector you're looking at. A quick point here is that multiples can either be on a forward basis or a trailing basis. Typically, the multiples that you hear of on CNBC or in papers or you read in research reports are typically on a forward basis, because you're more interested in what the earnings going forward look like, including the growth from here on. You are not too bothered about because a lot of these industries are also cyclical. So whatever their past performances may not reflect what their future performance are. So you will not pay them for their past performance, maybe a little bit, but you'd rather pay them because you're looking from the appreciation from here on. You'd rather pay them for the future performance. And typically, most of these multiples, except price to book and dividend yield, I think most of the other metrics are largely forward looking. They are typically 1 year or 2 year forward. So when I'm talking about 1 year forward price to earnings, for example, what I'm talking about, you have the price, market price as of today, as of the date that you're looking at, but the earnings per share is a 1 year forward or a 2 year forward. So sitting in April now, I would be looking at March 21 earnings per share, FY21 per share, or FY22 earnings per share, and I'll discount. So that is what I'll kind of benchmark my company against peers in the market. But for a price to book, you typically book is your book as on date. What is your shareholders equity as on date and premium as on date. So that's typically a current multiple rather than a forward multiple. Similarly, dividend yield is the dividend that the company is paying today. You could forecast, but dividend is a very company specific decision. So you typically see price to book and dividend yield more on a current basis, but all the others are typically compared on a forward looking basis. And all these multiples can be used both in trading comparables and transaction. I had kind of covered that in when I spoke about relative valuation. So trading comparables, or trading comps as we call it in industry, is basically a list of all the companies. So when you're looking at banks, PSU banks, you have all the banks listed out, and you have the P ratio, PB, price to book, your all those things, NIM and all those various criteria that you kind of track. You have all of those listed out, and you see what ROA, return on assets, are, and blah blah, all those things. And then you take a call. This particular company is doing really well on growth. It's doing really well on profitability. But when I'm looking at its price to earnings or price to book, it is at a discount. So again, given other factors are also evaluated, because there are a lot of factors which I spoke about, which is lot to do with sponsors, lot to do with competitive advantage, lot to do with industry, lot to do with regulations, and so on and so forth. So keeping all that into perspective, if everything were to be the same, if you were to see that there's a higher growth company, higher profitable company, more profitable company, and you see that it's trading at a discount, everything else, ceteris paribus, you would like to invest in that company because you know that that particular company is undervalued. On transaction comps, again, it all depends on whether there are a lot of transaction happening in your sector. But when you're comparing your company against companies in your sector, if you have a lot of transactions happening and you know what their transaction terms were, you know what price the deal happened at, you know what their debt was at that point in time, you know what their what the price to book was, what the EV by EBITDA was, what the price to earnings was, or what the maybe the EV per megawatt was. That can also kind of give you a very good benchmark to see where you enter at. So that, again, put everything into perspective, again, all those big buckets that you spoke about, because this is not apples to apples. Valuation is more an art than a science. Obviously, when you're looking at a specific sector and kind of going deeper and deeper, it becomes more like a science, because you're looking at a very homogeneous set of companies, and you're looking at very specific companies and benchmarks to look at. So it becomes much more structured. But when you're starting off, you compare like two sectors with each other. Maybe aviation you're looking at today, or you could be looking at banking versus how you look at pharma, could be very different. The dynamics of pharma, how you invest in pharma, extremely different from how you invest in banking, extremely different from how you invest in IT, extremely different from how you invest in power. So all of those have to be seen in tandem with what the market dynamics are and how well the company is placed. And depending on that, then you see how the price metrics, how the market multiples are stacking against the other peers. Like, for example, if I'm looking at a power company, there could be one power company which has, out of two power companies, both have 4,000 megawatts of power. One of them has 2,000 megawatts under construction. The other guy has all 4,000 operational. On paper, both of them EV by megawatt could be the same. But wouldn't you give a higher value to an already operational plant, because the risk is limited to that extent? You don't have the construction or implementation risk, so your risk is less. So wouldn't you pay a higher price there because your risk is mitigated? So so you have to put all that into perspective when you're looking at each of those multiples. But they do give a very good kind of relative benchmarking and a method of valuation which is very much back of the hand, back of the envelope, and you could still get to whether you could quickly know whether you are overpaying or underpaying or correct paying, right paying compared to where the market is at that point in time. Perfect. So I'm looking at the Q&A. The first question is from Aditya Gupta, aspiring to be an investment banker as well, either M&A or risk management, and according to you, really shines on the CV of the applicant, currently a BBA student. Okay, so this is a very pertinent question. When I graduated out of my college, I also didn't know really what is investment banking. Like I knew what is investment banking per se, but there are certain terms that are very, very commonly used in this space. There is something called a sell side, there's something called a buy side, and that's very critical to know what is what. So investment banking. So it's I'll just kind of clarify so that there is no kind of gap in understanding. Investment banking, you have a buyer, you have a seller, you have the investment banker in between. An investment banker will pitch to several sellers, he will pitch to several buyers. So when I want to sell my particular company, I will approach an investment banker. An investment banker will hear out my entire story, build a model for my particular company, build out the projections, get a value. Then he will pitch out to various prospective buyers with my particular company and see how good the response is or how good the kind of if there's interest in the market for my company. So that's typically what is the role of an investment banker. How you could be kind of well posed to get into an investment banking is if you could really kind of be a master of one of the sectors. So I would say that, see, a lot of this, when I entered into this particular space, even I knew very limited. But then what I always try to do is, and I always recommend students to do, is to take up one sector that you like. Take up any sector. Like probably you take up pharma, or you just take up one sector that kind of connects to you, and you read about it. You read research reports. You track the news. You track what's happening in those sectors. You see what are transactions happening at. Who are the investors who are investing big in those sectors. You be abreast of all that's happening in that sector, and uh, if you track those companies, you know what is undervalued, what is overvalued, which are the companies which are like extremely overvalued. If you look at, and there are various websites that give you a lot of metrics, right, like very, very readily available. So there's this website called screener.in. I don't know whether you're aware, but you could typically go there, plug in your company's name, and below you could see all the companies which are there, which are its peers, and it has a very good kind of comparison of this company versus all the companies. But not just that, I would like you to kind of delve a little bit deeper, get to know what are the factors, what are the success factors or the investment thesis for that industry, what are the USPs, what are the kind of reasons why you would invest in that company, what could be the competitive advantage for a firm versus the other, what are the risks in those businesses, what could be the mitigants to those risks. I think this is critical. And apart from that, if you have a sense of where you would like to invest in, given how the metrics are poised in terms of profitability, growth, and the market multiples, that kind of puts you in a very good kind of a readiness for a particular prospective employer to kind of gauge what your interest is and your competence as well. So the next question is from Debargya Bakchi. Can you highlight how you do risk management when using DCF? Do you use simulation techniques? Very good question, Debargya. So risk, there are so the risk is largely factored into the discount rate. Uh, Not always, but a large part of the risk gets factored into the discount rate. So discount rate is simply not like, if I'm looking at say cost of equity using FCFE, it's not simply RF plus beta into RM minus RF. No, that's not it. You have to add on various risks which are specific to the industry, which are specific to the investment, which are specific to your company. So that's where most of the risk gets built in. However, the cash flows may also build in some of the risks. Like for example, what would we typically do in the industry is that we have to value a company. However, there are very like for example, we are into this particular virus situation, and we could see that there's a reduction in traffic. There could be a reduction in power sales. Power outgo has come off. So there could be, what we do is we have cash flows laid out. We use a discount rate which builds in some additional risk for what the situation is. But at the same, we also do sensitivity analysis. So we make what is called a sensitivity table. So we just do that. If the traffic is lower by 10%, if the traffic is lower by 5%, if the traffic is lower by 20%, what would the value look like? So we have those sensitivity tables also there in the valuation, so that while we say that assuming that this is where the traffic will be, this is the value. But if we were to look at a traffic which was 5% lower using the same cost of equity, this would be the value. So that's how typically we address the risk factors. So the next question is from Arindam Mukherjee. Sir, in the price to book method, will the valuation will be correct only in case of efficient markets? Okay, so that's a very good question. Efficient markets is actually a efficient markets is more for the markets. Certain stocks may not follow the efficient market principle. Certain stocks might be illiquid, for example. Certain stocks might have, and that's where I said that all those various buckets which I covered before my valuation discussion, there could be certain issues with how they do their accounting. There could be certain corporate governance issues, which is where even if their markets are efficient, the price, and there are certain stocks which are there right up there in terms of their corporate governance policies, everything, promoter, their proactiveness, their moats, their competitive advantage. But when you look at certain other companies, you have to always keep in mind that efficient markets are always efficient, no doubt, and they will always kind of get to the mean. There might be some aberrations, there could be certain volatilities around the mean, but they will come back to the mean. You have always, like, it price will always kind of correct, but then particular stocks or particular companies may not be efficient because they might not have the liquidity, they might have issues which are very specific to the company. So the price to book, you have to be very specific which sector you are using. There are certain sectors that you typically, price to book is just one additional multiple that you'd look at, but there are certain sectors that you'll use price to book as the primary, like financial sector, like NBFCs or banks. You would use price to book extensively there, because that's where you would like to say that this is the equity, and over the equity you can leverage 6 to 9 times to 10 to 12 times. So that's very critical as to how they how efficient they are in terms of churning their book, the equity that they have. So it's very specific to the sector and the company that you're looking at. How to identify governance issues? Very, very important. No crystal clear answer, but you have to. There are a lot of ways. There are a lot of ways you could look at it, but typically, like, I could quote some examples, and there could be so many various ways of cooking books. It's across the board. There's so many ways that companies could hide their real financials. Like a tip, like there could be so many ways, but you have to really get into the financial statements and understand what is it that is happening, and not just financial statements for 1 year. You need to go back and see what did they promise, did they deliver on that, what did they promise, did they deliver on that in the next year's report, what did they promise, did they deliver on that. And if you see certain patterns where you see that there are certain, like for example, companies building on revenues, but then the cash flows are not stacking up, so all of that revenues is staying in receivables. So there are some receivables against government entries, and the government authorities may have actually disputed it, but they have been booking because they have certain policies around how to accrue revenue, right? Revenue, how do they recognize revenues? They have certain revenue recognition policies. This is that they were accruing revenues, but is it really cash flows? What we are bothered about when we are looking at valuations or anything, cash is the king. You want to know what the cash flows are. So there are various ways, but the best way is to look at annual reports over a period of time and see what they promised, whether they've delivered, and if there are certain peculiar things where you see that certain items in the balance sheet is growing, cash is not growing, or there are more investments happening, cash is never coming up, cash flow to operation is not stacking up. So you need to get really deep into the financial statements to understand if there are real governance issues. But even beyond financial statements, there could be things like things which are not, like, for example, there's something called a contingent liability. Now that's a ticking time bomb. They will not say what a contingent liability is, but you could have significant contingent liabilities in various companies. So it's a very specific to a sector, specific to a company kind of discussion. But I would suggest just go through the annual reports and try to understand and figure out if there are any patterns there. So the next one is from Advitya Mistry. What are the sectors we should include while creating a portfolio as per this lecture? Interesting. So you can start with one sector. So I would always say that become a master of one thing so that you really kind of know it in depth, and try to diversify from there on. I think there are always sectors which are favorite sectors, or sectors like really in season kind of sectors, and it varies. Public markets, there are certain sectors which are very much in flavor today, right? There is pharma, there's IT, there's FMCG, which are in flavor, recession proof or COVID proof in a way, or helping in the COVID situation. But when you're looking at private investments, for example, you're looking at startup investment. If you look at many of the deals like Byju's, education is very hot. So it is very different. If you're depending on what you are looking at, which particular pie you are looking at, the sectors that you're looking at. But what I would suggest is, if you have like real genuine interest, if you were to create a company tomorrow, if I were to say that I'll give you whatever amount you need, you set up a company, which is the sector that you'd pick up? Where is it that your genuine interest comes in? Take that, because that's where you will like kind of really put your insights. You'll read in depth and you'll try to see what are the key differentiators, competitive advantage for those industries. What are the risks? How do you mitigate? You'll really kind of learn it in depth. So keep it sharp, insights are sharp, keep it focused, and become an expert on one sector and then diversify. So the next question is from Sudhriti Sarkar. What are some of the important factors that an investor would consider for investing in any new business or startups, particularly after this pandemic situation is over? Very interesting question. I have been investing in startups for quite some time now, and I would say everyone. There could be some exceptions which I'm not aware of, but every investor in the startups is playing the diversification game. So there could be no one who gets it right in startup space, because there are so many people who could get upon the same idea, like come up with the same idea, try to do the same thing, but some execute it well, some don't execute it well. But what is super critical, and I showed that those various buckets, I would say what is super duper critical for a startup is, number one, you have very strong team, and you have at least 2 or 3 people who are there in the team, so that, and there is a strong alignment between them. Number one. Number two, the sector should be deep enough for you to allow you to grow.